Have you ever wondered what happens to the crew that was manning a tank that now looks like this? Or like this? Or what happens to them in a situation like this? Well, I'll tell you at the end where you can find out exactly what happens, although I don't recommend watching it. However, besides that, we're going to tell you the complete story of the T-72, some of its battles you've probably never heard of, and why its crews are still fighting in a tank first designed 50 years ago. Let's begin. The T-72 would be born from 1960s thinking and doctrine influenced by lessons on armor just learned in World War II. Tanks went through rapid development and in just a couple of short years, evolved from thin armored cans on tracks with machine guns into highly sophisticated, well-protected, and heavily armed machines. But this was still just the beginning of what was about to come. The Soviets had just witnessed how their waves of T-34s won the war against the Germans' much more sophisticated tanks through the power of sheer numbers, although at quite a high loss rate. Still, they got the job done, and that's what counted. The next generation tank would follow those lessons and doctrine from World War II, but make them better. Soon came the T-64A, pushing the envelope with, for the time, advanced technology. A 700 horsepower engine, a 125mm smoothbore gun, composite armor, and an automated loader, which was a shock to the world. This allowed it to be a much lighter and smaller tank, manned by only a crew of 3, while keeping heavy firepower equal to Western tanks, along with mobility and protection, at least to some extent. The T-64, however, turned out to be a rather temperamental and delicate machine, but it set the stage for the T-72, which would follow basically the same configuration, only trying to make it work better. Now, instead of chasing every high-tech feature, the Soviets wanted to combine the best elements of the T-64 with the simplicity and reliability of the older T-62 and design it to be a mobilization model. That meant that, in the event of war, the better-equipped tanks with cutting-edge technology, such as the T-64 and later the T-80, would be manned by elite units while the mobilization models would be reserved for the mobilized regular army. It wouldn't be the best tank in the world, but it would be simpler to build, operate, and train crews for, in case they were needed in the tens of thousands if war broke out again. Their power would once more come through sheer numbers, much like the T-34 in World War II. What they came up with was Object 172. It kept the quite powerful 125mm smoothbore gun and autoloader and used a more robust V12 diesel engine, producing some 780 horsepower. This design was intentionally old school, prioritizing practicality and quantity over quality and fancy features. Through trials and errors, ups and downs, the Soviet High Command finally accepted the simpler tank design, and it went into production as the T-72. Very soon after entering mass production, the T-72 proved it could be built 40 to 50% faster and substantially cheaper than a T-64. Over the next years, more than 25,000 units would roll off assembly lines in the Soviet Union and its allied nations, and it was just about to make its mark in history in some horrible ways. As the Western powers observed this new Soviet tank, they didn't feel entirely comfortable seeing that it could withstand a direct frontal hit from 105mm NATO tank rounds, TOW missiles, and many other older Western anti-tank weapons. This concern would soon push them to upgun all their tanks to 120mm, as seen in the Leopard 2 and M1 Abrams. Later, some non-Soviet aligned countries would receive exported versions of the T-72, slightly downgraded variants in fact, which led NATO to some extent to underestimate the T-72's true combat potential. But still, because of its sheer numbers, it raised alarms in the Western Bloc. However, until its real combat debut, much of the T-72's characteristics remained shrouded behind the Iron Curtain. Now, before we go into its combat debut, let's clear something out of the way. A 3-man crew and autoloader were chosen for many reasons, and a low, compact profile and lower weight were just some of them. Removing the human loader allowed for a roughly 1 meter shorter hull and freed up much of the space a traditional loader would need to operate. This way, as you probably already know if you are a military history maniac like me, the T-72 stores 22 rounds in a rotating carousel beneath the turret floor and feeds them automatically. This, at least theoretically, reduced crew fatigue and enabled faster sustained fire than a human loader, requiring about 7 seconds between shots, if everything worked properly. But of course, it came with its own set of downsides, like chopping body parts off the crew, breaking down in the middle of a firefight, limiting the gun depression angle, and the subtle little thing known as the jack-in-the-box effect. Nothing special, just the fact that if anything comes into contact with the ammunition stored openly inside the hull, you have a high chance of unwillingly becoming part of the Soviet space program together with your turret, like this. The gunner and commander were squeezed in between the big gun breech and the turret walls, with basically not much room to move anywhere. Relative to Western tanks, the commander's view was horrible, which explains what would happen in urban combat you are about to hear. The gunner was even more cramped, and both had to watch where they put their body parts, as the machinery could eat anything that should not be in the way. I do not think I need to go into too much detail, but there were several quite grisly accidents. The gunner had his 125mm main gun and coaxial machine gun to operate, while the commander had the DSHK heavy machine gun. These two were completely surrounded by ammunition in the carousel and on the turret floor, basically sitting right on top of it. And if God forbid something happened, there would not be much time for evacuation before everything went up in flames. Unlike modern Western tanks, which usually have blowout panels and ammunition somewhat separated from the crew by armor, in the T-72 this is not the case. However, the autoloader carousel is actually protected with some armor around it, and the additional rounds stored elsewhere around the tank are the bigger problem. So, in many conflicts where crews could resupply easily, they often chose to carry fewer rounds to lower the risk of immediate explosion upon penetration. Later variants like the T-90 would try to address this issue with some ammunition stored in armored containers, but it still shares the same basic problem. Then, in front of the hull sat the third and last member of the crew, the driver. His position, compared to the turret crew, was much more comfortable and roomy. His controls and gear levers were described as relatively easy to operate, although there was an issue again. The reverse gear in the T-72 is notoriously slow for some reason, only about 5 km per hour, or 3 miles per hour. The good thing is that the driver is a little separated from the ammunition storage, and there are actually instances of drivers surviving even when the turret was blown off, although overpressure and flames usually did not give anyone a chance to escape. An interesting thing to mention is that the T-72 has snorkeling equipment and can cross rivers up to 5 meters deep with a snorkel tube that would be mounted in place of the commander's hatch. It is rarely used in practice, and the crew has to go through specific training for this nerve-wracking feature. Before doing so, the crew must fully seal the tank and activate its overpressure system, the same system that also protects it against nuclear, biological, and chemical threats, which will be important when we finally nuke each other somewhere in the future. Combat debut. There is an anecdote that during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, Syrian T-72s just received from the Soviet Union engaged Israeli armor. It is said that the T-72s knocked out at the time state-of-the-art Israeli Merkavas, which caused a bit of panic throughout NATO forces. Whether this was true or not, it was clear by the early 1980s that the T-72 in such numbers was undoubtedly a deadly new threat to Western armies. While in some initial battle records the T-72 proved devastating, there were many more that showed catastrophic losses. The Iran-Iraq War showed the T-72 in large-scale combat for the first time. Under Saddam Hussein, Iraq acquired hundreds of T-72Ms from the Soviets, and these were some of the most advanced tanks at the time, now fighting against Iran's mostly older, Western-made tanks like the American M60 Pattons and British Chieftains. Unsurprisingly, the T-72s had a significant upper hand in these engagements. They defeated entire divisions in just hours, and the T-72 quickly became the most feared tank of the war. But this war also exposed its vulnerabilities, most of which still haunt the crews to this day. In close urban fights, the then-modern RPG-7 proved devastatingly deadly to the T-72 from the rear, sides, and roof, showing exactly what would happen with one well-placed hit. A huge internal explosion, setting off the entire ammunition load and causing the complete destruction of the tank, and well, its unfortunate crew inside, for whom an open casket wouldn't be an option. Then came 1991, and if the Iran-Iraq War was the T-72's high point, the Gulf War would be its lowest. By this point, Iraq fielded many T-72 versions, alongside other older Soviet-era tanks. When the US-led coalition launched Operation Desert Storm, they were concerned about how their newly deployed Abrams would fare against the much-discussed T-72. To make matters worse, the T-72s had the advantage in terrain and were mostly dug in prepared defensive positions, waiting for the American tanks to advance across the open desert. But no one could have imagined the armored massacre that was about to happen. You know what I mean. US Abrams and Bradley fighting vehicles engaged Iraqi armor in a nighttime sandstorm, and the thermal sights, night vision, and 120mm depleted uranium armor-piercing ammunition, coupled with air support and coordination, resulted in about 150 T-72s being destroyed for no US tank losses. Iraqi tanks were hit and destroyed without even being able to see the American tanks, let alone effectively return fire. Now it seemed that the T-72 was just useless, nothing more than a coffin for its crew. However, in reality, in this case, it was manned by poorly trained crews in downgraded models without proper support and coordination. But the myth of the T-72's invincibility was shattered, and from this point on, it was only going to get worse, especially for its crews. Now came the Chechnya War in 1994, which would put the T-72 into conditions for which it was never designed. Using it with poor tactics didn't help either in the brutal reality of urban combat. In the ill-fated invasion of Chechnya, Russia deployed T-72s and T-80s in huge armored columns, expecting a quick and decisive victory. Tanks rolled into the city of Grozny in parade-like formation, but instead of seeing the defenders surrender at the terrifying appearance of tank platoons, they were met with something very different. Chechen fighters armed with simple anti-tank weapons and with a surplus of bravery and creativity for ambushes. Small hunter-killer teams were positioned throughout the bombed-out city. They waited and let the first tanks enter the city. Then, as the rear ones were driving in, they sprung the trap. The rear tanks were destroyed from all angles by RPGs at close range, while machine guns and snipers dealt with the infantry caught in the open. The main tank force was now trapped inside the city by the burning wrecks of tanks behind them. Although there is not a single recorded instance of a T-72 being penetrated by an RPG hit through the frontal armor, no amount of explosive reactive armor could help against multiple RPGs coming from every possible angle and hitting the tanks repeatedly. If they turned their guns to fire at one Chechen position, fighters from the other direction would have a clear shot at the thin armor on the rear of the turret, which would ignite the ammunition inside almost immediately. To make matters even worse for the Russian tankers, they couldn't even elevate their guns enough to fire at RPG teams on higher floors. They would later deploy ZSU anti-aircraft vehicles exactly for this. In just one day of fighting, 20 out of 26 T-72s were burning, along with dozens of other armored vehicles. Grozny got the nickname Tank Cemetery, and surviving Russian crews would later describe the horror of this street fighting, where they watched as tanks brewed up in fireballs one after another, with what would become a signature quirk of the T-72, shooting out its turret after a huge internal explosion. The Russians would learn that advancing like that in a city without proper infantry support would end exactly like this. But that does not mean the T-72 would not be deployed the same way again and again, in multiple criminally negligent tactics across the world. Although the T-72 is far from being a junk tank, the same tragic scenario could be seen in another horrific example of poor planning and urban fighting. When the war in Yugoslavia began in 1991, the T-72 family of tanks found itself fighting against guerrilla fighters in Croatia. One of the bloodiest such battles was when Yugoslav M84 tanks, which were a locally produced and virtually direct copy of the T-72, attacked the suburbs of the city of Vukovar. Expecting to break lightly armed guerrillas with a heavy armor assault, the Yugoslav tanks entered what would become the infamous street called Trpinjska Cesta. Croatian fighters saw the tank column approaching and set up a trap. They let the M84s pass their first positions and drive well into the narrow street, with no side streets, just homes on both sides of the road, one way in and one way out. When the major portion of the column was inside, the Croatian fighters knocked out the lead and rear tanks with RPG-7s from basically point-blank range. They were so close that the fighters actually had problems with the RPGs because of the minimum firing distance, which is a safety feature to prevent the charge from detonating too close to the soldier firing it. With the exit and entrance blocked by burning tanks, the rest of the column was tightly packed together, with infantry caught between the vehicles. The outright massacre began. Dozens of tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed in quick succession, while the rest tried desperately to break through, pushing the already burning ones that were blocking the way. Many got stuck in ditches beside the road as they tried to get out of the kill zone. The street earned the name Cemetery of Tanks, much like Grozny we mentioned earlier. However, nothing has proven better how a small and cheap weapon could destroy $1 million piece of equipment than what we see in Ukraine today. No tank design currently in use was ever created with today's battlefield in mind, because back when they were designed, no one could have imagined what modern armored warfare would look like. We now have much more powerful and varied handheld anti-tank weapons, ranging from tandem charges designed to defeat explosive reactive armor, to top attack systems like the Javelin, and of course drones, that can either guide heavy artillery directly onto tanks or strike their weak spots with razor precision. No amount of cages, add-on armor, or these so-called turtle tanks can effectively protect even the most modern vehicles against all of these threats. This, however, goes for all tanks, not just the T-72. Oh, and I didn't forget, back at the start, I mentioned you could find out what the aftermath of an explosion inside a T-72 looks like. I still don't recommend watching it, but if you really want to know, you can find it on Reddit by searching for T-72 Grozny 1996.